In a world where power and privilege dictate the rules, one man's choices lead to a chain of events that will alter the course of his life forever. A rich man, with everything to lose, makes a decision that will haunt him for decades. But 24 years later, the past comes knocking, and everything he thought he controlled starts slipping through his fingers. This is the story of betrayal, revenge, and the unexpected twists that life throws your way. It all started years ago when Thomas Ellis, a wealthy businessman with a reputation for ruthlessness, made a decision that would change everything. At the time, he thought he was just solving a problem, but what he didn't realize was that he was creating a future he'd never be able to escape. He fired Sarah Jenkins, a young black woman who had worked for him as a secretary. The reason? She was pregnant with his child, a secret he wanted to bury. But what Thomas didn't count on was Sarah's strength. Sarah left Thomas's office that day with nothing but her dignity and a determination to build a future for herself and her child. The betrayal stung, but it fueled her resolve. She raised her son, Marcus, alone, determined to give him a life filled with love and opportunity. Over the years, she worked multiple jobs, never asking for pity, only respect. But deep down, she knew the day would come when she'd have to confront Thomas. Little did she know, her son, Marcus, would be the one to lead the. Marcus grew up hearing stories of his mother's strength and the injustice she had faced. He never knew the full story, only bits and pieces passed down through the years. But as he got older, he began to ask questions. Why had his mother been fired? What had happened to the man who had been responsible for their struggles? It wasn't long before Marcus learned the truth, and it burned a fire inside him. The idea of revenge slowly took root, and he knew one thing for certain: the time had come to end. At 24, Marcus walked into the same office that had once rejected his mother. But this time, he wasn't a broken man. He was a force to be reckoned with. With a business degree under his belt and a sharp mind, he had become a successful entrepreneur. His presence in Thomas's office wasn't by accident. He had waited years for this moment, and now it was finally here. He didn't just want an apology, he wanted more. He wanted to make Thomas face the consequences of his actions, and to watch him squirm. Thomas had built an empire on the backs of people like Sarah. He had long since forgotten the names of those he'd wronged, thinking he was untouchable. But the moment Marcus walked into his office, something inside Thomas shifted. It was a strange feeling, one he couldn't quite place, a mix of recognition and dread. Marcus introduced himself without any preamble, his calm demeanor masking the storm inside. "I'm Marcus Jenkins," he said. "And I'm here for what you owe." Thomas froze, the weight of the words hitting him harder than he expected. He had forgotten about Sarah, but he had never forgotten the guilt. He had buried it, just as he had buried the memory of the child she carried. But now, standing before him was a man he had wronged, a man who had every right to demand retribution. As the silence in the room stretched, Thomas felt the walls close in. This was no longer just about a fired secretary. It was about a life, a family, and the power of the past. Marcus's eyes didn't waver. He wasn't here to beg for anything. He was here to take what was owed, and Thomas could feel that in the air. The tension was thick, and for the first time in years, Thomas was the one who felt small. His thoughts raced, his mind desperately trying to come up with a solution, something to control the situation. But Marcus wasn't interested in negotiations. "This is about what you did to my mother," he said quietly, his voice steady. "This is about making sure you can." Thomas's pride was everything to him, and seeing it crumble in front of this young man made him question everything. He had built his success by stepping on others, never looking back, always moving forward. But Marcus wasn't just some person from his past, he was a reminder of his darkest secret. Thomas tried to change the subject, to steer the conversation away from the uncomfortable truth, but Marcus wasn't having it. "You fired her," he said, his voice hardening. "Because she was pregnant with." Marcus's words hit Thomas like a slap to the face, but it wasn't the kind of pain that came from physical force. It was worse. It was emotional, the kind that left scars deeper than anything he could see. Sarah had always been strong, and Marcus, now standing in front of him, was living proof of that strength. Thomas had spent years convincing himself that firing Sarah was a necessary evil, but as Marcus spoke, he realized the true evil lay in how he had discarded a life without a second thought. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood there, unwavering, while Thomas's mind spiraled. He knew what he had done, and in that moment, he knew the price he would have to pay. But was it too late for redemption? Was there even a way to fix what had been broken all those years ago? Thomas couldn't answer, and it terrified him. Marcus wasn't asking for forgiveness, he didn't even expect it. This wasn't about redemption. It was about confronting the reality of his actions, no matter how. "Do you remember her?" Marcus asked, his voice almost cold now. "Do you remember the woman you fired, the one you humiliated? The one who had no choice but to walk away from everything?" Thomas's heart pounded as he searched his memory. It had been so long, and he had pushed it all away. He had built a life without thinking of the consequences. But standing in front of him now, Marcus was a constant reminder of those consequences. Sarah's strength had lived on through her son, and now, Thomas was. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. The memories of Sarah, her eyes full of hope and trust, flooded back, and for a brief moment, he regretted his actions. He hadn't just ruined her life, he had stolen a future from his own child. Marcus, sensing his hesitation, leaned forward. "You think you can just move on, forget about the people you've hurt?" he asked, his voice still calm but filled with purpose. "Well, you can't. Not anymore." Thomas took a deep breath, the weight of years of lies pressing down on him. "I made mistakes," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "But what do you want from me, Marcus? You think I haven't paid enough?" The room was thick with tension as Marcus watched him. "Paid enough?" Marcus repeated. "You haven't paid at all. You've lived your life, untouched, while my mother worked herself to the bone just to survive. You've built your empire on the broken backs of people like her. The trut." Thomas tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. He had spent so long protecting himself from the consequences of his actions, and now, standing before Marcus, he realized there was no escape. "What do you want me to do?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus stood still, staring at him, before answering. "I want you to understand. I want you to know that I'm not here for your apology. I'm here because you need to." A long pause followed, and for a moment, it seemed like Thomas would break down. But instead, he stood up, forcing his body to move, to reclaim some semblance of control. "I can't change the past, Marcus. I can't undo what I've done. But I can try to make things right." Marcus's gaze never wavered. "It's not about changing the past. It's about facing the consequences. You took from my mother, and now you'll see what it means to lose everything." The challenge in his voice was clear. There would. Marcus turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I'm not asking for your money. I'm not asking for anything but this. I want you to live with the knowledge of what you've done, every day, for the rest of your life." With that, he walked out, leaving Thomas alone in his office, the weight of the years finally catching up to him. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas Ellis felt small, his empire of power reduced to nothing more than a fragile facade. In the days that followed, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. His usual arrogance had melted away, replaced by a deep sense of unease. For the first time, he found himself reflecting on the choices he had made, and the faces of those he had wronged. He had always believed that money and power could protect him from the consequences of his actions, but Marcus had shown him otherwise. He couldn't escape the feeling that his past was catching up to him, and it. Marcus, meanwhile, had no intention of simply letting things slide. He kept his distance from Thomas, but his mind was always working. He knew the man was struggling with guilt, but that wasn't enough. Marcus wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done, every waking moment. His plan was far from over. What he had started in that office would echo in Thomas's life for years to come. But Marcus wasn't doing this for revenge, he was doing it for his mother, for the woman who had suffered in S. One evening, as Thomas sat alone in his office, he received an unexpected call. It was from a woman who had worked for him years ago, one of the many faces he had forgotten. Her voice was familiar, though the name didn't immediately register. "Mr. Ellis," she began, "I wanted to let you know that I've seen what happened with Sarah. And I just want you to know. She wasn't the only one." The words hung in the air, and Thomas felt his heart drop. He had forgotten how many lives he had affected. And the woman continued, "You were ruthless, Mr. Ellis. I didn't realize it at the time, but now I see. What you did wasn't just about Sarah, it was about everyone who worked for you. You built your empire on the backs of people you never bothered to truly see." Thomas was speechless. The truth was settling in, heavy and unrelenting. It was one thing to face Marcus, but now his past was creeping in from all directions. There was no running from it anymore. No place left to hide. As the weeks passed, Thomas found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues, once loyal and eager to please, began to distance themselves. Whispers filled the halls of his company, rumors of his past spreading like wildfire. People started questioning his leadership, his decisions. It wasn't long before Thomas realized that the empire he had so carefully built was beginning to crumble. And the worst part? He knew he had no one to blame but himself. Marcus had opened his eyes to the reality. The weight of his past actions bore down on Thomas with an intensity he had never anticipated. He tried to bury his guilt under a veneer of business deals and boardroom victories, but it wasn't working anymore. His thoughts were consumed by Sarah, Marcus, and the countless people he had wronged. For the first time in years, he was questioning his choices. The once steady foundation of his empire was shaking, and Thomas couldn't deny that his past had come back to claim what it was owed. Marcus, on the other hand, remained calm and focused. He wasn't watching Thomas's downfall with joy, but with a sense of purpose. He knew this wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Sarah had lived with the consequences of Thomas's actions for too long, and Marcus was determined to make sure that no one else would ever have to face the same fate. The power dynamics had shifted. Marcus now held the cards, and he wasn't going to let Thomas forget what he had done. David's warning echoed in Thomas's mind as he sat alone in his office, staring at the stacks of papers in front of him. For the first time, he felt completely powerless. He had spent years building his reputation, but now, everything he had worked for seemed meaningless. His wealth, his success, his influence, none of it mattered. He had made a critical mistake, and it was too late to take it back. As the hours passed, the weight of the truth settled in, and for the first time, Thomas was forced. David's warning echoed in Thomas's mind as he sat alone in his office, staring at the stacks of papers in front of him. For the first time, he felt completely powerless. He had spent years building his reputation, but now, everything he had worked for seemed meaningless. His wealth, his success, his influence, none of it mattered. He had made a critical mistake, and it was too late to take it back. As the hours passed, the weight of the truth settled in, and for the first time, Thomas was forced. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his pursuit of justice, but his approach was measured. He wasn't interested in seeing Thomas completely destroyed. He wanted him to understand. He wanted Thomas to know what it felt like to lose everything you thought was secure, to be exposed for the person you truly were. Marcus wasn't interested in bringing down a man who had already fallen, he just wanted Thomas to feel the consequences of his actions. And with each passing day, it became more and more clear to Th. As time went on, Thomas realized there was no easy way to escape the consequences of his past actions. The pressure from his employees, the whispers in the boardroom, and the weight of his own conscience were relentless. He began to isolate himself, avoiding the people who once praised him and leaning into the solitude of his office. The once vibrant empire he had built now felt like a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. Every day, he could feel the walls closing in, and he wasn't. Marcus, however, was always one step ahead. He had watched Thomas long enough to know his weaknesses, and now, it was only a matter of time before the final pieces fell into place. He had no intention of destroying Thomas outright, no, that wouldn't be satisfying. What Marcus wanted was something far more painful, a slow, drawn-out reckoning that would eat away at Thomas's pride until there was nothing left. He wasn't going to let the rich businessman slip back into his old life without consequence. One evening, as the sun set and the lights in Thomas's office flickered, he received another call. This time, it was from someone he hadn't expected, his own daughter, Claire. "Dad," she said, her voice uncertain, "I need to talk to you. People are saying things about you. Things I never thought I'd hear." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. His daughter, the one person he had tried so hard to protect, was now caught in the fallout of his actions. For a brief moment, he wanted to lie. "Dad, what's going on?" Claire pressed. "Why are people saying you're involved in all of this? I don't understand." The silence stretched between them as Thomas struggled for words. He had always prided himself on being a father who provided, who shielded his children from the messiness of the world. But now, his past was threatening to engulf everything he had worked for. He had no answers for Claire, no way to explain how he had let his ambition blind him to the pain he had caused. "I'm sorry." As the days turned into weeks, Thomas tried to regain some semblance of control, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was falling apart. Claire's disappointment, the constant pressure from his company, and the haunting presence of Marcus kept him up at night. He couldn't escape his own guilt, and worse, he couldn't figure out how to fix what he had broken. The walls around him continued to close in, and he realized, too late, that the man he had once been, the powerful, untouchable Bu. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas tried to regain some semblance of control, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was falling apart. Claire's disappointment, the constant pressure from his company, and the haunting presence of Marcus kept him up at night. He couldn't escape his own guilt, and worse, he couldn't figure out how to fix what he had broken. The walls around him continued to close in, and he realized, too late, that the man he had once been, the powerful, untouchable Bu. One morning, as he stared out the window of his office, Thomas saw a group of reporters gathered outside. He had seen this before, this was the beginning of the public fallout. It was inevitable. His personal life, his mistakes, everything he had tried so hard to keep hidden, was about to be exposed for the world to see. The media was already circling, hungry for the story of the wealthy businessman brought low by his own sins. Thomas couldn't hide anymore. He had tried to outrun the truth, but the headlines the next day were brutal. Rich CEO's secret past exposed, a woman fired, a child forgotten. The story spread like wildfire. There was no hiding from it now. Thomas's reputation, once untouchable, was shattered. It wasn't just about Sarah and Marcus anymore, it was about everything he had done to others over the years. The news reports dug deep, uncovering his past wrongdoings, his ruthless decisions, and his heartless pursuit of power. Thomas had spent his life building an image. In the midst of the media frenzy, Marcus watched with a sense of grim satisfaction. This wasn't about destroying Thomas. This was about forcing him to confront everything he had done. The public disgrace was only the beginning. Marcus had planned it this way, knowing that the consequences of Thomas's actions would ripple through his entire life. The empire Thomas had built was no longer a symbol of success, it was a symbol of his fall from grace. Marcus wasn't watching this unfold with vengeance. Thomas sat in his office, staring at the headlines that covered his desk. He had once been a man who controlled everything, who made the rules. But now, he was nothing more than a subject of his own story. The weight of his guilt, his regret, and his shattered empire pressed down on him. For the first time in his life, Thomas truly understood what it felt like to lose everything. He couldn't undo the past, and he couldn't erase the damage. All he had now was the haunting realization that, no matter. The months that followed were filled with more disappointment than Thomas had ever imagined. The business world, once so eager to collaborate with him, now turned their backs. Investors pulled out, partnerships were severed, and his company, once a shining example of success, began to falter. Thomas tried to hold on to the remnants of his empire, but the weight of his past actions had left him with nothing solid to grasp. Every meeting felt like a formality, a countdown to the inevitable collapse. The months that followed were filled with more disappointment than Thomas had ever imagined. The business world, once so eager to collaborate with him, now turned their backs. Investors pulled out, partnerships were severed, and his company, once a shining example of success, began to falter. Thomas tried to hold on to the remnants of his empire, but the weight of his past actions had left him with nothing solid to grasp. Every meeting felt like a formality, a countdown to the inevitable collapse. Despite the chaos around him, Thomas found himself seeking solace in his memories. He thought back to the days when his office had been filled with laughter and ambition, when he had been surrounded by people who looked up to him. Those days felt like a distant dream now. But there was one memory that kept him grounded, one that filled him with both regret and a strange sense of peace. He remembered Sarah, the woman he had fired so many years ago, and the strength she had shown. She had never asked. It was late at night when Thomas made the decision that would change everything. He reached out to Marcus, knowing it was the only way to begin repairing the damage he had done. The message was simple: I want to make things right. He didn't expect forgiveness, he knew he didn't deserve it. But he was finally ready to take responsibility for the hurt he had caused, to face the consequences of his actions. Marcus's response was brief, but it was all he needed. You've taken the first step, Marco. With a sense of nervous anticipation, Thomas met Marcus face to face for the first time since their confrontation. The tension between them was palpable, but this time, it was different. Thomas wasn't the powerful businessman he had once been. He was just a man who had lost everything and was finally ready to make amends. I'm sorry, he said, his voice sincere. For everything. For Sarah. For you. For all the people I've hurt. Marcus didn't speak right away, but his eyes softened. It's a star. The weeks that followed were filled with self-reflection and hard decisions. Thomas began taking steps to undo the damage he had caused, starting with reaching out to the people he had wronged. It wasn't easy, and it didn't come with any guarantees. Some were willing to listen, others weren't. But every apology, every attempt to make amends, was a step forward. Slowly, he began to rebuild the relationships that had once seemed so insignificant in the face of his ambition. It wasn't about regaining. Marcus continued to watch from a distance, but now, there was a sense of quiet approval in his eyes. He had never expected Thomas to change overnight, but he had hoped that the man would eventually see the light. The road to redemption was long and filled with obstacles, but Thomas had taken the first step. As he worked tirelessly to rebuild his business and repair his relationships, Marcus knew that it would take time before the full weight of Thomas's actions would be understood. But the journey. One day, as Thomas sat at his desk, he received a letter from Sarah. It was the first time in years that he had heard from her. He opened it slowly, unsure of what to expect. The words inside were simple, but they carried a weight he wasn't prepared for. "I've forgiven you, Thomas. It took time, but I've let go of the past. I hope you find the peace you're searching for." For a moment, Thomas couldn't speak. He had never imagined that Sarah would offer him forgiveness, but now that she had, Thomas knew that redemption wasn't about expecting forgiveness, it was about earning it. And though he had taken the first steps, there was still a long way to go. He had started to repair his relationships with his family, his employees, and even with Marcus. But deep down, Thomas knew that the true test of his redemption would come from within. Could he truly forgive himself for the hurt he had caused? Could he live with the knowledge of what he had done, and still move forward with his life? As the months passed, Thomas continued his journey of self-improvement. He worked tirelessly to rebuild the business, but this time, it was different. He wasn't just trying to make money, he was trying to make things right. His decisions were now guided by a sense of responsibility, not ambition. Slowly, people began to trust him again. His employees noticed the change in him, and his family saw the sincerity in his actions. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. For the first T. As Thomas continued on his journey, there were still moments of doubt. He often questioned whether he was doing enough or if he would ever truly be free from his past mistakes. But with each new day, he saw that the road to redemption wasn't a straight path. It was filled with setbacks, but also with moments of clarity. He learned to appreciate the small victories, like the trust he regained from his team or the quiet approval of his daughter, Claire. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but One evening, as he sat with Marcus in a quiet cafe, Thomas reflected on how far he had come. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, his voice a mix of gratitude and reflection. "I've made so many mistakes, but this is different. I've been trying to fix things, but I know it's a process. I don't know if I'll ever get it all right, but I'm trying." Marcus nodded, offering a rare, approving smile. "That's all anyone can do, Thomas. Trying is all we have." The two men shared a moment of wonder. Months later, Thomas stood at the front of a meeting, addressing his team. The room was quiet, but this time, it wasn't because of fear. It was because of respect. "I know I haven't been the leader you all expected," Thomas began. "And I know I've hurt many of you. But I'm here today to tell you that I'm committed to making this right. I've been given a second chance, and I will not waste it." The room was still, but there was a shift in the air. People were starting to see the man Thomas was. As the years passed, Thomas's life transformed in ways he never imagined. His business began to thrive again, but this time, it was built on trust and integrity. He mended his relationship with his family, earning back their respect and love. And while he would never forget the mistakes of his past, he had learned to forgive himself. It was a journey that had taken him through pain, regret, and loss, but it had also taught him the true meaning of redemption. Thomas Ellis was no longer a man Deafy.